Are you addicted to food? Is food perhaps even as addictive as tobacco, alcohol, drugs? I don't know, but that's what we're going to be talking about here on the show today. We have a leading expert on food addiction. Matter of fact, the developer of the Yale Food Addiction Scale. She is currently an associate professor of psychology at the University of Michigan and a bucket list of a guest on the exam room if there ever was one. With that, we welcome Dr. Ashley Gearhardt to the show. Thank you so very much for making the time.
Absolutely my pleasure to be here. Thank you for speaking with me.
It is truly my honor. And I'll tell you, right before we got going, I asked my wife, I said, listen, I am speaking to the grand poobah of food addiction. Is there something that you would like for me to ask her? And my wife was like, why? But it wasn't in like, why are you asking me to ask her a question? It was like, why? Why is food
Yeah.
so daggone addictive? What is it about food that makes
Yeah.
us just hooked?
So, the first thing I want to kind of note is we really don't think it's all food. And when I first started doing this research, we didn't have a lot of research on the sorts of foods. And I think some would argue they shouldn't even be called food. These sorts of ultra processed, industrially created, super refined substances that have been optimized to deliver such high amounts of refined carbohydrates like sugar and flour and fats at levels that way surpass what we get in nature. And in these sorts of packages where the fiber and the water and the protein, all that kind of nourishing stuff that makes you kind of have to stop and eat your food. Well, that's all been stripped out. And so it rapidly, you can eat it so fast, it melts in your mouth because it's almost been pre chewed. You digest it so rapidly, and then it hits your brain so fast. So we don't see people struggling with foods like bananas or apples or beans or salmon, the sorts of foods that have nourished us for most of human existence. But when we started to mess with the food supply in ways that really altered them to be maximally rewarding, maximally craveable, that's when people really started to struggle and lose control.
All right, for the purpose of this interview, let's define what an ultra processed food is. You talked about stripping away the good stuff, the water, the fiber. What makes a food ultra processed
Yeah.
versus just a regularly processed food?
Yes, this is such a good question, and it's something that the field is really, getting into and debating a lot right now. So there is this classification. It's called the NOVA classification that looks at different kinds of foods, and it's like there's minimally unprocessed food where the ingredient is essentially what it is: apple, salmon, carrot. And of course, humans have processed food for a long time to allow it to be able to be shelf stable or to make it slightly more appealing. So, if you're thinking of canning foods or salting foods, that's something we've done for a long time. But especially back in about the 1980s, the technology we have around food and food development and food creation really kind of took off, and we were able to do all sorts of things to food, like create high fructose corn syrup and sort of fats, like trans fats, that would just stay stable, even at room temperature and not rot, and have all these additives and emulsifiers and extractors. And the industry saw this as an opportunity to make lots of money. Those products, you could really combine them and create these substances that, when I think about it, when I think of an ultra processed food, I look at the ingredient label and there are a number of ingredients on there I don't know how to pronounce. And I'm a food scientist. I'm like, I have no idea what that is. This is clearly not something I could make in my home kitchen. But when I say the sorts of foods that people usually get ultra processed versions of, the ready to eat, ready to heat stuff you pick up at the grocery or the fast food restaurant, it's foods like chocolates and sweets and salty snacks and Taco Bell and frozen pizza. And it's now over 50% of the food supply here in the United States are these kind of industrial chemical concoctions. And what they do is that we are designed by nature to like carbohydrates and to like fats because they give us calories and we need calories to survive. And that was a huge threat to human survival. So our reward system of our brain really perks up and pays attention to carbs and fats. But for most of human existence, how we got that was, a handful of berries is how we got our carbs. Hunting down a buffalo was how we got fat. And they were kind of hard to get, hard to come by. And these ultra processed versions, things are stripped out and refined. So those carbs and those fats can be isolated and then prepackaged together in ways they never existed in nature. So in nature, carbs or fat typically come separately. You usually don't have a naturally occurring food that's high in both fats and carbs. In contrast, when we think of milkshakes and pizza and ice cream and Taco Bell burritos, those foods have high levels of both refined carbs and fats that seem to have a super additive, powerful effect on our brain in a way that seems to put it into overdrive, and really a similar way to how we see addictive drugs start to amplify that system.
And I heard you talk once in another interview where you really kind of drove home this point about processing and just how crazy of an effect it can have. You pointed out that something as mundane as cauliflower
Yeah.
also has nicotine in it, the same way that tobacco does, right? But it's not exactly, though, people who are trying to quit smoking are going to go to the fridge
Yes.
and eat a couple cauliflower florets and suddenly their nicotine craving is gone. It's really the processing
Yeah.
process that causes all of these cravings, or for the effect of it to really just kind of intensify. So I mean, is it theoretically possible to really put cauliflower through the ringer to the point where you could crave it the same way you would a Marlboro Light?
I would say so you're fully right. The thing that I think I really try and emphasize is that addictive substances, they don't really exist in nature in their pure form. You know, we take things like fruit and ferment it and alter it to make it an alcoholic beverage and typically add sugar or, carbonate it. We take a tobacco leaf. The reason the tobacco leaf is where we get our nicotine is it has higher amounts of nicotine in it than something like eggplant or cauliflower. So it's easier to refine and alter and process in a way that it delivers a rapid dose at a high level of that reinforcing substance into your brain. Cocaine is caused by processing the coca leaf and drying it, turning it into powder form. Uh, Opioid is poppy seeds poppy flowers that we alter and change. So when I think about our food supply, and when we've taken things that, our reward and motivation system was designed to want us to get carbohydrates and fat, and these processed addictive substances like cocaine, like alcohol, like nicotine, they hit that reward and motivation system that was optimized to get calories, and it starts to amplify it and put it into overdrive where you start to chase that drug rather than things that are good for you. Now, when I think about these ultra processed foods, we can't get people to eat enough fruits and vegetables. We've had these huge educational campaigns, encouraging people to eat more fruits and veggies, 5 a day, spent millions of dollars on it. And they usually don't have much effect. Most people don't start eating more. In general, like, just imagine if there was like a educational campaign that was like, eat more French fries and chocolate. It'd be like, great, you don't have to tell me twice. Like, we don't need that, right? Because it's so easy. Our motivation is so high. And so when I think about what could you do to the cauliflower to make it, start to compete with the nicotine product, yeah, you add a bunch of flour and you deep fry it and you dip it in ranch and you amplify the amount of like carbs and fats and flavor profile with that cauliflower, then maybe it can start to compete. But in its unprocessed form, you're just not getting, there's nothing magical about the chemical signature of nicotine in and of itself. It's how it's delivered in tobacco products, often amplified by flavor additives too. Things like menthol and sugar and cocoa are really prevalent and are really part of the addictive package of cigarettes. And that's also part of what we're seeing with these ultra processed foods. It's not just, this rapid dose of refined carbs and fats, but there's all these flavor enhancers and texturizers and things that make the taste and the feel so unique to that specific food product. And you start to get attached to that, and that starts to be some of what can trigger your cravings.
A few years ago, when somebody told me this, I looked at them kind of like they had two heads initially. They were like, well, Chuck, a lot of the cigarette manufacturers also got into the food game. And what you're describing there is it sounds like they are taking kind of the same playbook as far as refining tobacco to make it more addictive as they are what you were just describing with the cauliflower. I'm not saying that, there are cauliflower snacks out there that I'm sure are pretty darn addictive, but,
Mhm.
it's like the same kind of playbook seems to be implemented between those tobacco companies when they were shilling cigarettes versus, some of the stuff that you're seeing on store shelves that you have no idea. Oh, by the way, it's the same company.
Oh,
Is that any coincidence?
that blew my mind. I just learned about that too, which is again surprising given that like I'm in this field. But I think the level of overlap between big tobacco and food companies has really surprised even the food science community. And that there's this amazing work coming out of UCSF where they've taken some of the industry papers that were able to be uncovered from the lawsuits against big tobacco, and they're able to look at what they've done in the food portfolios because Philip Morris and RJ Reynolds in about like the late 1970s, 80s started buying up food companies. And I think of that as them diversifying their portfolio when, there's starting to be some hot takes around the addictive, harmful nature of their tobacco products. So they diversify, they buy up companies like Kraft and General Mills and Hawaiian Punch. And there's clear documented evidence that they were using flavors, additives from their cigarette profile and their processed food profile, that they use specifically marketing strategies that they had honed in tobacco of targeting children and racial ethnic minority communities more aggressively to develop kind of very loyal brand users, and doing it in a way that made it harder for parents to protect their children and harder for minority communities to divest from the support from those large industrial corporations. And so, from about 1980 through the 2000s, it was big tobacco that was the biggest producer of these ultra processed foods. And so I don't trust big tobacco, given their history and their playbook of what they did with tobacco and how good they were at making these products highly addictive, and then trying to mask that so people were informed. And if people were struggling, the playbook has been with alcohol, with tobacco, with opioids. Oh, it wasn't us. It wasn't our products that we made and refined and used, huge research and development budgets to maximize, their potency. It was just a few bad apples that if they just had more willpower, then it wouldn't be a problem. And that playbook has been very, very effective at diverting attention and blame away from the companies that will say, we're creating our ultra processed food products to have maximum craveability, to hit your bliss point, to enhance moorishness. So you want more and more and more. To me, those are all just code words for addictive.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the word bliss point, and that brings me to kind of reward pathways and how the brain just loves to be happy.
Totally.
How do those reward pathways work specific for food? Say you eat that slice of cake, what happens upstairs in that old dome of ours?
Yes. So, some research that's come out of the University of Michigan, Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson have done some groundbreaking work that we almost have like two systems and the reward and motivation part of the brain. So we have the part that gives you that bliss, that kind of liking. That's thought to be more of your opioid system that exists in your brain, endocannabinoids. These are the things that give you that pleasure, blissy feeling. And there is evidence that these fats and these carbs and sweet taste release opioids and endocannabinoids in the system, and kind of that same mechanistic pathway that opiates or pot would do. But the thing that seems to really distinguish addictive substances is what they do to dopamine. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter that seems to really enhance our motivational drive, how much we want something, how much we crave it, how much we would go out of our way to get it, how much we can't think of anything else about it. And one of the interesting things about addictive drugs is that over time, you first get it, that first bite of ice cream, early on, you have a drink of alcohol and it tastes so great, that you get that pleasure, you get that bliss. And the dopamine system wakes up and says, oh, wow, that was great. I need to remember every cue that tells me when this is available. And when I see that cue, I need to seek it out and go get it. But over time, the more you use addictive substances, that bliss, sometimes it fades. I'm a clinical psychologist and I've treated people with substance use disorders. And they've said, like, I don't even get high anymore. Like, it's not as enjoyable as it used to be as when I first started drinking or I first started using. But when I see that cue or that person I used to use with, or it's that certain time of day, I want it so bad I can't think of anything else. And what we see in the context of these ultra processed foods is they hit that big stamp of bliss by hitting you with both sugar and fat and all these flavor enhancers that make those, substances even more potent. But our dopamine system really pays attention to the cues, and the dopamine system gets released as well at the magnitude with sugar and fat and ultra processed foods at about that same magnitude as we see with ethanol that's in alcoholic beverages or nicotine that's in tobacco. And so it's really amplifying it and stamping in that next time you see that cue, next time you see the Taco Bell sign or the Golden Arches, or you walk by that vending machine at work, it triggers that wanting, that drive, that desire that's hard to satiate. And so with food, we see that, with these foods, it's those sorts of reward and motivation processes happen the moment you see the cue that tells you that it's available, or that cue that makes you want it or think about it. And dopamine starts to get released when you're smelling it, when it first hits your tongue, particularly for sweet taste. We come out of the womb wired for liking sugar and sweet taste. It is a powerful actor on our brain from the moment we're born. And then once the food starts to hit the gut and is digested, there's evidence that you get a second surge of dopamine as the body breaks down the fats and the sugar and they enter into the bloodstream. And then, those changes in the bloodstream cross into the brain and you get another surge of dopamine. So you're kind of getting these like repeated hits of, reinforcement, desire, wanting for these substances in ways that are more amped up at a magnitude that really kind of mimics what you'd see with something like nicotine and ethanol, rather than, let's say, like a handful of carrots.
Uh, let, let me ask you this. How quickly does that, what I would call the blunting effect, wear off in terms of food versus maybe, alcohol? Because I would venture to say, if somebody's everyday drinker, right, it's going to take more for them to get drunk over time.
Yes.
But if they stop drinking and say go a couple of months and then they have a beer or a glass of wine, they're probably going to get buzzed a lot faster than they had been.
Yes.
And in terms of food, I can tell you that it took me about 3 days one time to go without Taco Bell before I was in complete panic, just freak out, like straight rage mode, to the point where I put my fist through a wall and
Yeah.
then I put my fist through a door because I hadn't had Taco Bell, which sounds absolutely crazy. But when I finally cratered because I couldn't take it anymore and I took that first bite, it was like instantaneously
Yeah.
everything was right in my world again. And
Absolutely.
had I not gone those 72 hours, I don't think I would have had as powerful of a reaction. So I'm just curious how quickly that blunting effect can fade when it comes
Yes.
to food.
I would say no one has looked at that very important question of what the timeline looks like right now. What we do know is what you're describing there is what we call kind of a deprivation effect that we see with addictive substances, is that particularly in the first few days, if you haven't used it, if you haven't smoked your cigarette or gotten your ultra processed food fix or your alcoholic beverage, that the first 48 to 72 hours is when your system is really reacting, and you're in this withdrawal state, and your body is feeling deprived because it's gotten used to getting that fix, and all of a sudden it's not there. And so that there's some evidence that that is the peak point where you're just jonesing for it, you're craving it so bad. There's evidence that if you can make it 2 weeks, that some of these withdrawal symptoms that make it so hard to cut down, that they start to lessen and things start to feel a little better. And then, the longer you go, within like a few months, things are kind of have stabilized and you feel better than you did when you were using the substance, where you're having all these like hits and crashes all the time. When it comes to kind of that, how long would it take, for the system to reset? There's also some evidence about our taste, and how when we're consuming foods that are really sweet and really fatty and really salty, there's work done here at University of Michigan by Dr. Monica Duss, and it finds that the more sweetness and saltiness and fattiness that we're eating, our taste buds our kind of taste profile starts to adjust, and we start to expect that level of intensity. So let's say you ate an apple and you thought, oh, this apple is sweet and crisp and enjoyable, and I really like it. And then for 2 weeks, you eat tons of sweet, sugary, overly intense, ultra processed foods, and you eat that same apple again, that it won't taste as sweet. Your body has said, no, I don't get out of bed for anything that is not this sweet and this intense. There is good evidence, though, that if you change the diet, most of the evidence is around salt, within, a couple weeks, your body will readjust. And so all of a sudden, something you can find pleasure from less salty foods than you had when your taste had changed to get adjusted to so much flooding of salt.
Yeah, anecdotally, I can tell you that that's 100% true. Just eating, it was like a ready-made, gosh, what was it? It was like an Indian doll that came in a pack, and you put it in the microwave for 90 seconds. And I hadn't had anything like that in forever.
Yeah.
And all I could taste was the salt in it. I
Yeah.
was like, oh my gosh, this is just a salt bomb. And then you flip it over and you look at the amount that's actually in there. It's like overwhelming. And I was like, well, there you go. It's funny how your taste buds change. And I don't think, Dr. Gearhardt, maybe, you could talk about this as well. I doubt today, even though as much as I had a huge affinity for Taco Bell way back when, if I were to have a bite of it now, don't think I would get anywhere near the same sense of enjoyment.
I think you're right. I think, what can happen also, this isn't, especially in humans, it's not just a pure reward process. I think what we've seen is that as you can learn about things, and the way that you view a certain substance changes, and instead of thinking about it, the expectations you might have about pleasure and what it's going to do for you emotionally and how it's going to distract you from stress, as you start to kind of cognitively change your expectations, and instead see, actually, I feel way worse after I eat these foods, and I'm not going to feel better. And these foods have been designed to try and trick me. And I don't feel, I mean, one of the things I think is so fascinating about these, ultra processed foods is that even though there's so many calories, because of the way they're created, they often don't make us feel as full or satiated. And so you can keep piling them in, even though you're getting, 1,000 calories, because they don't have the fiber and the water and the protein that other foods do. And so as you start to kind of cognitively learn that actually this isn't that great anymore, I don't like it, that you're not as easily pulled back in to the super additive nature of these stimuli. And you start to realize how good you feel when you're eating real food, and you almost feel like I've like always been like, we have dry January now, where it
Oh
kind of
yeah.
helps people take a step back and be like, oh, my relationship with alcohol has maybe gotten a little out of control, or wow, I feel a lot better when I'm not drinking alcohol. My sleep is better and I feel less of a crash. I'm always like, if we can almost get like a 30-day, you like dry ultra processed food February, well, I guess that'd be 28 days, and you just saw how much better you felt when you're eating real nourishing food, that it would make transitioning back into those ultra processed foods maybe a little bit less appealing.
Well, here's the interesting thing, though. I agree with you 1000%, but I think then we also need to reshape the way that we look at food
Yeah.
because, I mean, how often do you hear of somebody going on a diet? And we're going to put
Yep.
that one in quotes, as we often do here on the show. But then the reward after 4 weeks and maybe they've lost 10 pounds is to indulge in the things that they've taken off of their plate for that time, So maybe it's a pizza,
Yeah.
maybe it's a trip through the drive through. And then I can tell you from experience that once you reintroduce that
Yeah.
back into your system, that kind of you're really tempting fate for that diet to fail again because you're going to eat it the one day. Oh man, yeah, I remember how good this tastes, right? Maybe your taste buds haven't completely changed at that point,
Yeah.
and so you want it the next day and the next day, and the next thing you know, the trips to the gym have stopped, the salads have stopped, and it's been replaced by burgers and fries all the time again. What are your thoughts on cheat days and using food as a reward?
Ooh, that is, I would say haven't done a ton of science on that. I would say some concerns that are arisen for me. I think different people have different things. And for some people, maybe particularly people who don't feel a massively huge addictive pull, we do see that having a personal history of difficulties with other addictive substances, or having a lot of people in your family who've had challenges with things like alcohol or cigarettes, that can be a risk factor for you to develop an addictive relationship with these ultra processed foods. So I think it's important to know where your risk profile is. Um, some people, the cheat day might release some steam. In general, for folks who are experiencing more of this like kind of push pull addictive battle with these foods, we know that what we call intermittent access, where you restrict for a while and then you binge and then you restrict again and then you binge, that cycle seems to sensitize the addictive mechanisms in the brain. It seems to make dopamine even more likely to flood at those cues that say, oh, the fast food is right around the corner, and make it harder to resist. And so I often think more along that realm of trying to find sustainable diets, sustainable lifestyles for people that kind of focus on a harm reduction approach is how I think about it. So we'll see that for people that sometimes people will set this like, I have this perfect diet in mind, and it's so narrow and it's so hard to adhere by that it starts this vicious cycle of the what the hell effect. Like, I'm never ever eating anything that ever has chocolate on it ever again, and then they have a bite of chocolate and then they are off to the races, right? And so we want to figure out what is actually sustainable for people. But what I often think about is that those foods that are the highest risk foods for you, the ones that might be the foods you would most want on the cheat day, the full pizza, the milkshake, those are foods that I would often think about, more taking a break from, because those high risk foods, especially if they're how you start to reward yourself, and it starts to take up such a high level of importance in your life, you're kind of making a food that's already designed to be so rewarding for you even more salient and rewarding. And so to me, I would think in the long term, it's better to think about how do you reward yourself in a way that is not something that might trigger addictive processes for you. It's good to reward yourself, but if you're prone to this addictive response to those foods, a cheat day could be really risky.
Yeah, yeah, and it took me years to get to a point where I was even comfortable eating a wrap.
Yeah.
Just filled with like spinach and sauteed mushrooms and red peppers and like all healthy vegetables, maybe some balsamic or hummus in there. Because I equated a wrap
Yeah.
with the burrito from Taco Bell. And that was 100% psychological, right? I mean, that's 100% up here. Nonetheless, it was a powerful thing. So
Yeah.
like there was like a whole lot of, well, what's going to happen when I take this bite? Is it going to be the same way that it was years ago when I was on that cookie diet and went 3 days? Like, is this flood, this tidal wave of everything going to wash back over me?
Yeah.
And this is going to be the end of it. Luckily, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But it took me like a long time just to even like feel comfortable dipping my toes into that water. And to this day, Doc, I still think about that every single time I'm about to sit down with the wrap. It's crazy. It just is.
No, I don't think of it as crazy. I think of it as that there is, especially those cues. Like we think about it with people who are trying to do things like non-alcoholic beer. Like for some people that helps feel like, it's kind of adjacent to beer and it can help kind of stem my cravings. For other people, it actually primes them to just want the real thing. And there are individual differences on that people kind of have to explore for themselves what does and doesn't work. I think a lot in my work about context. We'll work with people who've maybe had some riskier drinking and don't want to fully abstain, but want to learn to drink in a less harmful way. And so one of the things we'll do is be like, alcoholic beverages differ and how risky they are. A low alcohol beer, a glass of wine is a really different beast than, Bacardi 151, these substances that have higher potency and higher addictive potential. For a lot of people, it means those alcoholic substances that are on the highest risk, that is something that just may never be back in your life. But if you're going to try and have the glass of wine or the beer, we really focus on the importance of doing it in safe context and in safe settings. So not when you're super stressed, not when you're super hungry, not when you're with triggering people. And so I've thought about this a lot with these foods, that foods, I think, for individuals are really going to vary in how risky they are for them to trigger that addictive pull. And when you're trying to figure out where are my boundaries where things are safe or not, or you want to try something that's a little riskier for you, that it's important to do it in a context. Often, I think, with other people, often in a time where you're not stressed, emotional, or super hungry, to be able to find ways to figure out what works for you to make your life most livable, but that isn't triggering you to constantly be in a battle with what you are or aren't eating.
A couple more. I can tell you right now, I would love to bring you back because there's just so much ground to cover here. This is, I mean, it's just fascinating, fascinating stuff. Are we able to say whether or not men or women are perhaps more likely to be addicted to food?
It's been really fascinating, Chuck. Like it's really, I've seen a lot of variability in studies. Um, I would say overall, like when we've kind of collated across like all these studies, it seems to be pretty equitable actually between men and women. We see that might differ at different life stages. So when we look at teenagers, it looks like teenage girls might be at slightly more risk than teenage boys. We've had another study on older adults, and we saw, especially in women 55 to 64 years of age, that they were about twice as likely to meet for ultra processed food addiction relative to men in that same cohort. But then there's other life stages. I think of early adulthood and kind of middle age as the times where this is when we see a really high escalation of difficulties, often because people are really stressed and really time strapped. And I think one of the biggest challenges is convenience. Ultra processed foods are convenient. They have all these additives that help them just sit on a shelf, and you either open up a bag and just pour it in your mouth, or you heat it for a few seconds and it's ready to go. Real food takes time and prep, and it rots, and you can't just have it like sitting out all the time. And so I think people get really hooked on convenient, highly rewarding ultra processed foods and early adulthood and in middle age in a way that's a really kind of equal opportunity problem.
The women 55 to 64, that's an interesting tidbit there. Are you looking at whether or not that ties into hormonal changes at that point of life?
Yes, so we actually, a colleague of mine, Kelly Klump at Michigan State, has just started to do some great research on menopause and hormones and eating and binge eating. And we will be assessing for food addiction symptoms and to be looking at how hormonal changes, especially that occur during menopause and at certain times of life, we know that our reward system is intimately linked with our hormone systems of stress and estrogen and testosterone. And as those things fluctuate, our sensitivity and vulnerability to these ultra processed foods, also thinking about that time of adolescence for young girls, we really don't know. And we really need to think in this kind of broader systemic way about risk and risky periods. And then it might change over the course of life that you might have not had that much of a problem, but then there might be a really stressful time in your life or a hormonal transition that could then suddenly change your relationship with these foods in a way that we need to be aware of the potential risk associated with them.
Two more. You came out with a poll not too terribly long ago that found 1 in 8 adults over the age of 50 fit the criteria for food addiction. Given the fact that obesity rates are what they are, the fact that they continue to climb, do you suspect that 1 in 8 will also continue to increase over time?
Unfortunately, yes. And that we see some what might be called like a cohort effect. So in those older adults, I really think of the time point when the food environment started to change in such a toxic way. That is when we started to see this escalation of obesity and diet related disease and binge eating was all around that like late 1970s, 1980s moment. And there's lots of factors that were feeding into it. One of those to me was, though, big tobacco getting into our food supply. And so if you were already, 20 or 30 years of age when the food environment started to change, you may be less vulnerable than somebody who was 2 or 3 years old when that food environment changed, because a greater percentage of your life and more of those critical developmental years when your tastes are getting established and your rewards are getting established and your brain is really developing and is really plastic, more of that was lived in a moment where you were just entrenched in a toxic food environment that we weren't even, it took us a while to catch up to how bad things were. I am really concerned about what we're seeing with, there's estimates that 12% of children meet the clinical cutoff for an ultra processed food addiction. And we don't usually see addiction in children, right? We protect them from alcohol and cigarettes and things like that. I'm so concerned to see how this tracks over time, because if 12% are already hitting that in childhood, our research really finds that adolescence and early adulthood is when things really start to then escalate and get out of control. And so I'm concerned that now people are living their whole life, us included, from the moment we're born, and this level of toxicity of these really addictive ultra processed foods. And what is that going to mean as this kind of continues to snowball over the course of life? And we'll just have to see, unfortunately. But I do feel optimistic that we're starting to see, like, it's no longer kind of a debate, I think, as much about that food and the food environment is playing a really central role in the spread of obesity and diet related disease around the globe. And now I think we're really trying to fully understand what is it about the sorts of foods that are in our environment now. And I would argue, it's not just that they're unhealthy for you, but that they hook you in an addictive sort of way. So even if you're having health consequences or mental health consequences, that it makes it so hard to not just keep coming back for more.
It's pretty wild. It's very wild. And I know that, these drugs, they work a little bit differently, but I can just see somebody watching this or listening to the podcast saying, well, why can't there be something like naloxone or Narcan for nachos, for goodness sake? Like, why isn't there that yet?
Yeah. There actually is a little bit of research on that, if you believe it. So there is some work out there in the context of obesity and binge eating and a little bit on food addiction of people using naloxone and bupropion, so psychopharmacology for addiction, that kind of targeting these reward mechanisms, that seems to have some effect for reducing addictive eating, reducing binge eating. Now, like, even with alcohol and things, like that hasn't been, it's not a slam dunk, like 100% home run. We just give everybody naloxone and there's no more problems. But I do think with addiction, we've generally been kind of slow to think about what are medications that we can integrate into our psychological and behavioral health treatments to try and help people really succeed. And I think that is a potential future direction to look at more. And I would say, the new GLP-1, Wegovy sort of medications that are coming out right now, there's some fascinating work that's anecdotal at this point, but that those medications that are leading people to lose a lot of weight and feel more in control of their eating also seem to maybe help people drink less alcohol. And so I think the mechanisms and the parallels here are so overlapping that we should really be doing a lot of crosstalk across addictive drugs and addictive ultra-processed foods to think, how can we help each other? But we've learned from every addiction epidemic under the sun that we never are able to treat our way out of it. We have to take courageous policy, legislative, litigation changes to alter the environment that surrounds the addictive drug. So it's not cheap and easily accessible and heavily marketed, particularly to kids. That changing those levers in our society is what gives our treatments a fighting chance to work and makes less people get kind of caught up in that addictive net of that sort of substance.
We're going to leave it there. That's a heck of a to be continued. I love what you just said. It's really hard to treat your way out of something, which means that there have to be other changes that are made to make that change last.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're trapped in the cycle. You're absolutely trapped in the cycle. There is so much more we could get into with that, but I will tell you what, this 41 minutes and 57 seconds have just flown by in the blink of an eye, and this has just been a real treat. I am so enthralled by all of the research that you have done and continue to do, and I really look forward to Dr. Gearhardt continuing the conversation with you.
Absolutely. I would love to, and thank you again for taking the time to invite me. I really appreciate it.
If your health IQ is a couple of points higher than it was a few minutes ago, go ahead and like this video or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And to take it even higher, head over to Apple Podcast or wherever you get your favorite shows. Look for The Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. Hit the subscribe button there as well and help to make your world a healthier place.